Hi. So today we are going to be talking about Edward Hopper, who, according to this book, is a modern master. And this is going to be an interesting one to talk about because I am not necessarily a big fan of Edward Hopper. He's going to be the first artist here we talk about that I'm a bit lukewarm about. But he is interesting. He has a lot of interesting stuff about him. And we're also going to talk, he is an American, and he's a very American artist. And there's something interesting to bring up about America in art history. We tend to think of America as being quite a culturally dominant country, specifically United States of America, I should say. Not the Americas, not the other parts of America, just the one country in America that insists on calling itself America. But we tend to think of America, United States, as being quite a dominant cultural sphere. Here we are, all of us in the world. We are wearing the blue jeans. We are listening to the rock and rolls. We are eating the McDonald's, and we are watching Hollywood films. Mickey Mouse rules the world. So a lot of people might think that in the art world, surely, if Americans dominate the music industry, if they have a dominant film industry, dominant this and that, surely American artists must be quite dominant. There must be like a high proportion of fine art must be from America, right? And it's kind of interesting that that's not really the case. America has, for much of art history, been kind of a bit of a backwater. And for some of that is obviously natural. America is a younger country, so it's not necessarily surprised that there aren't that many great Baroque artists from Virginia, or so many famous Renaissance Minnesotans, because we're talking about art that predates America. But considering that America has been around, I mean, America still has been around for 100 years, 200 years now. Soon, well, it would have been, no, it's 250 years, like, it's coming up. There's still enough time, you'd think, for some more impressive art scenes to have developed and have had a more major impact. But until quite recently, historically, American artists have not really had much of an impact on the world. If you look at, say, we talked about Impressionism earlier, if you look at the early modern era, all of the really more interesting stuff still happens in Europe, in the old world. Of course, you have the Impressionism in France, but that even morphs and changes. And as it goes sort of around Europe, you have some masters that, like the Dutchman, Van Gogh. You have someone like Edvard Munch in Norway making stuff. Later on, you start getting Cubism involved in experimenting. Futurism, the futurists were, you had the Italian futurists, you had the Russian futurists, you have the Dada movement that comes up in Switzerland, and sort of German-speaking part of Europe. Berlin becomes a very interesting haven for avant-garde modernist art in the early 1900s. And what you don't really get is any of this kind of bubbling modernism in America, and not to the same extent. And that is interesting, especially because we tend to think of America as being quite a youthful country, a very capitalist country. And capitalism, unlike what some people, I don't want to get into politics necessarily, but unlike what some people will say, there's obviously a lot of people who are artists in the art world that are quite rabid anti-capitalist. But if you actually look at history from art history perspective, where there is a lot of capitalist activity, where there's a lot of commercial potential, that is actually when art tends to thrive. Art tends to actually work well under capitalist system in many ways because you have this emergent new class, middle class, that wants to buy art and often wants to prove themselves in some ways, want to prove that they are cultured, intellectual. It's the story why Netherlands becomes a big part, a big cultural golden age of artists. It's the reason why you have lots of great artists in the Renaissance in Florence and Venice and the Papal States. Money and art does tend to go hand in hand, even today, obviously. There is obviously a lot of issues with that. And I can't say it's a good thing, the way that rich people will often pay absurd amounts of money to buy famous art, almost as a way to, money laundering almost. We could do a whole thing about that, but it's also a very funny issue because I don't want to make this channel a channel where we talk about socialism versus capitalism and whatnot. Just saying what I'm saying more or less though is that in general, actually a lot of interesting art does happen in places where there is vibrant industry and vibrant commercialism and where things are happening, cities that are lively and busy. And you'd think, looking at the turn of the century and last turn of the century, not the 1800s to 1900s, not 1900s to 2000s. But you think that in America, there was a lot of stuff going on. A lot of skyscrapers being built like that, lots of the jazz age starting to emerge. And yet, you still wouldn't be necessarily looking at America as the sort of foremost place of the new hip art that's being developed. Things start changing eventually, and there's a big thing that happened in Europe that kind of destroyed a lot of the intellectual elites and the cultural elites in Europe. It was two events that you may have heard of: World War One and World War Two. And a lot of people in higher sort of cultural circles also happened to be Jewish. This was certainly the case in much of Central Europe. And, well, we know one thing that happened that made Jewish people kind of upset with Europe, kind of those who happened to survive the Holocaust. A lot of them weren't that interested in staying in Europe. We see in the 50s a shift happening, where suddenly New York goes from being, a prominent city to being the city for a lot of art. This is when we get a generation of artists. This is the kind of first American art form, which is the abstract expressionism. We're talking about people like Pollock, talking about people like Newman and Rothko, and I can bring up a female artist because this is a good opportunity to do that. Helen Frankenthaler. She is quite fun, I like her. You get into Pollock wasn't color field painter, but the rest, Newman and Rothko, color field painting. And anyway, we have an art style that's being developed that's very abstract and very kind of it lacks a lot of the European pretensions that had come before. This was something new, and it's worth noting like Pollock was a rock star when he became big, and the images that were shared of Pollock doing his painting on the floor in the studio, those images published on People magazine, I think, those were a big deal, and this was something very different. You'd taken away the kind of European, historically, the European ideal of we're gonna put, the canvas is somehow to be respected. It's important. We should have some idea of sacred attitude towards this thing where we're painting up on the wall and we're taking the time with the pencils. Here you have this guy in New York who puts the canvas on the floor, walks all over the canvas and just doesn't even use the finest paints. He just gets industry paints, the cheapest paints he can. He puts in like sand in the paints. He puts in cigarette ashes in the paints. He does all these nasty things that you're not supposed to do if you're an artist. Not certainly not if you're trying to be like following the academic art tradition, where you're trying to make yourself seem like you're a sort of sophisticated person. He is what we would refer to today as a goblin mode. he, he goes for it completely, just makes a mess of the whole thing, and it's quite radical. And a lot of people to this day, they tend to think of Pollock tends to be a bit misunderstood. A lot of people think that it's just random splatters of paint. And there's a lot to love about Pollock, but it very much one thing that you need to have in mind with all of these artists is the size of their work. And that, I think, is where we get the biggest continuous influence on artists today. Americans have had a huge impact on contemporary art, but it's something that is all things relatively new. And following Pollock and the other abstract expressionism, you get sort of minimalism, then you get the pop art movement, and of course you have Andy Warhol, who is a very important figure in American art and world art, contemporary art. His influences, he had a big influence on the art world in New York up until the 80s. You have him as a sort of paternal figure, even in 80s New York, fostering artists like Basquiat and Keith Haring. And then other thing happens, and just like I mentioned World War II and World War I earlier, another big catastrophe sort of happens that ends up killing a lot of people, the AIDS crisis. And the AIDS crisis is kind of to blame for destroying a lot of New York's hip reputation as an art heaven, because a lot of those artists in New York died. Because artists tends to be, there's a lot of artists who are gay, a lot of artists like having sex, and a lot of artists were drug users. So yeah, it's sad. But the point is, and then sort of nowadays, it's not necessarily there's no real center of art. Though I would say that by the 90s, the big hip art cities would have been London or Berlin. America has, yeah, there's still, obviously a place for American artists. It's still interesting though that America, despite being known for having such a cultural dominance in other spheres, don't really have that in the same extent as in art. American artists don't necessarily have that privilege the same way that American filmmakers, American musicians have, in the sense that there is this huge industries that are located in America for these fields. The art world is a little bit more decentralized, especially these days. But I'm gonna go and grab some coffee, and then I'm gonna talk about the book that I'm supposed to talk about.